I'm going to be sharing today a story that is a little obscure, but one that I think has a good word for us. It's one of those stories that may appeal more to a man's preferences than a woman's, but I could be wrong. But the lesson is important for all of us. And it comes from the 3rd chapter of 2 Kings, verses 4 to 27. And I'm just going to read the first verse or two of this passage to get us into it. Now King Mesha of Moab was a sheep breeder who used to deliver to the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But when King Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. Mesha ruled over a fairly small kingdom. Moab was geographically stuck between two wadis. I think I've shared with you before that a wadi is a dry riverbed. In the case of the northern river, it's probably better termed a river because I don't think it really dries out much. The southern one is more appropriately a wadi because it only has water in it during the rainy season. Basically, if you look at the the western border of Moab, it is the lower half, the southern half of the Dead Sea. And across the Dead Sea from them would be what we call the southern kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah. This is the period after David and Solomon when the kingdom has been divided into two. The northern kingdom we refer to as the kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom is the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Israel has just finished being under King Ahab, arguably the worst of the kings that they had. But what we need to remember is that throughout the biblical witness, the kings of the northern kingdom are consistently described as being evil or doing evil in the sight of the Lord. So no matter who you're talking about in the northern kingdom, you can pretty well bet that they're not worshiping Yahweh the way they're supposed to. They've either introduced idols or they are somehow not quite pure in their worship of Yahweh. The southern kingdom, however, has a mix. Sometimes you've got a good king, sometimes you have a bad king. The northern kingdom has more land. It extends actually across the Jordan River into what today would be, I think, Jordan. And it extends down a little bit down the east side of the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea. And their border is that northern river that marked the border of Moab. When we talk about that river, the Arnon, we're talking not just about water. We're talking about a gorge. A pretty dramatic, impressive gorge. And this thing is deep, steep-walled, and goes on for quite a distance. So it's a natural border and a major obstacle to crossing. Everything north of that river technically belongs to the king of Israel. Everything south is Moab. But Moab is a vassal state. They've been required for some years to pay tribute in the form of lambs and wool to the kingdom of Israel. Well, the rebellion actually begins before our lesson. It actually begins during Ahab's reign, because apparently Ahab was distracted enough by other issues that Mesha was able to either all at once or bit by bit stop paying the tribute. But once Jehoram, the second son of Ahab, comes to the throne after Ahab's death, Mesha decides it's time to really go all out. And he actually begins military excursions north of the Arnon River. He slowly eats away at what was effectively a border security for the northern kingdom. He gains one city after another. And he really, at this point, presents not only a financial drain on the kingdom of Israel, but he also presents a border security threat. And Jehoram realizes at this point he has to act. Now, he had a couple of choices. He could just take his force, march eastward out of Samaria, the capital of his nation, and around that northern tip of the Dead Sea, and attack straight on, going south into Moab. But there are several obstacles that he would have to deal with there. And I think one of the primary reasons he chooses not to go that way is precisely because of those obstacles. First, he'd have to retake the cities that Mesha has just taken, and he'd have to figure out how to cross that gorge, probably under fire, if you will. I mean, not by guns, but slingers and archers and so forth. They'd be on the other side just waiting to cut people down as they were trying to cross that gorge. So he did, I think, what makes more sense, and that is he marched south through the southern kingdom. And in doing so, it also gave him the chance to ask King Jehoshaphat, the king of the southern kingdom, if he would join him in this campaign. And so he did. Jehoram had a little over 10,000, maybe 11,000, 12,000 guys under his command. And to that, Jehoshaphat could add about 6,000 or 7,000. And it just so happened that the kingdom of Edom, which is south of Moab, belonged to Judah, and they had their own puppet governor in there that's described as a king in the text, but is not really a king. They picked him up in his force as well. And so by the time they're really ready to go, they've got almost 20,000 men. And these 20,000 men are marching across below the Dead Sea, and they have to kind of go around another valley. This is a dry river valley, and they get about 7 days' journey, and suddenly realize they don't have enough water. We're going to die of thirst. We're on the brink of turning to make the attack, and we're going to die of thirst. Now, what you need to know about Jehoram is Jehoram has inherited his father Ahab's poor faith. He believes in Yahweh, and he's even made a few corrections to the worship life of Israel, but he hasn't gone whole hog, and so he still is described as evil. Remember that Ahab had brought in Baal worship and had brought in, with Jezebel, his wife, had brought in worship of Asherah, and they had all kinds of prophets, at work for those two idols. And Yahweh and his worship got pushed to the side. So Jehoram does not have anything really to build on in terms of a sense that he can rely on God. But he gets out there in the desert and he says, Yahweh has tricked us, basically, into coming out here with the three kings, and we're going to all die because that's what Yahweh wanted. He's convinced that it has to be Yahweh who's done it. Well, Jehoshaphat, as I said before, is a good king, and he responds with a kind of neat response. He says, how can you know for sure that's what's going on if we haven't consulted God, if we haven't consulted a prophet? Don't you think we ought to ask first to find out if that's what's going on? And it just happens to be that one of the guys that's there in leadership says, hey, the prophet Elisha is nearby. Elisha was the protege of Elijah. And they all decide that it's appropriate to go to Elisha and ask, and so they do. Three kings show up in front of the prophet, and the prophet says, I don't want anything to do with you, Jehoram. He knows Jehoram's heart. He knows his character. He knows his lack of faith. But Jehoram says, look, we've got to have an answer from you. This is Yahweh's doing. And Elisha says, well, if it was just you, I'd ignore you. But since I have great respect for Jehoshaphat, I'll give you an answer. And so he goes and consults with God, and he comes back with a much better answer than was asked for. First of all, he says, here's what God says. God is going to take this dry river and he's going to turn it into pools upon pools of water. You won't hear rain, you won't see rain, you won't hear thunder, you won't see lightning. But tomorrow morning, it's going to be full of water. You, your armies, and your beasts of burden will all be able to drink, and you'll be fine. But that's not a very big thing for God to do. That's a kind of a trifling thing. So in addition, God is going to give Moab into your hand. And here's how you're supposed to conduct the campaign. You're going to go in, and you're going to attack and lay waste to every major city, every town, anything of significance. Kill everybody, and cut down every tree that's good for fruit. And anytime you come across a piece of farmland that looks like it's any good at all, every person is to take a stone and fill that place with stones. Now you can imagine if 20,000 people came upon a 1 or 2 acre plot of land that was farmable, and all of them threw a stone on there, even if they only threw one stone, that's going to be a problem for quite some time. But that's the instruction. So, the next morning, exactly what Elisha says comes true. The valley has filled with water. It's a godsend, literally. And the whole camp gets up and they start collecting water and drinking and so forth. Meanwhile, on the other side of the riverbed, the Moabites have mustered anybody of fighting age because they knew this army was coming. And they're there to repel the attack. They look across the river, which is now filled, and the morning sun is glinting off of it with a red tint. And they see this, I think, as a sign. This is blood. It looks like blood, the water. And they see all the commotion going on the other side of the banks. And they believe that what's actually happened is the three forces have risen up against each other and they're starting to slaughter each other. So all they got to do is cross the river, run over there, and start fighting, and they'll win the day. Well, they run across, start to attack, and discover, lo and behold, that ain't what's going on. And the force from Israel absolutely decimates them. And then they continue their march. They march into southern Moab, and everything they come into contact with, they lay waste to, just like they were instructed. Until they come to what was the capital at that time, which is Kir-Hareseth. It appears that it was a walled city of some sort, and so they had to lay siege to it. Now, there is no way that Misha's forces are going to prevail against this siege. And Misha knows that. So he kind of gets up on the wall and he stares out at the force before him and decides that the weakest spot, if there is one, is the forces under the king of Edom. And so he decides to take 700 of his best men, foot soldiers, and they try to break through that line, but to no avail. They're sent running back into the city. Now what is Misha going to do? It looks on the surface like the only option he has is to surrender. But he's not willing to do that. He believes, and we get some of this indication from a stone that he carved some years later called the Moabite stone. Up to this point, his god Chemosh has been giving him victory right and left. It would be like a sacrilege almost not to at least try something else. So he decides in a last-ditch effort that the best thing he can do is make a really dramatic sacrifice to his god. And he takes the heir to the throne, his eldest son, the one who's going to reign when he dies. And he marches him up to the wall, and in full view of his own people and all of the enemy, he cuts his son down and offers him up to Chemosh as a burnt offering. And the story ends in the scripture with a very simple statement that really doesn't explain anything. It says, great wrath came upon all Israel. And they pulled away, they broke off the siege, and they went home. Why in the world would they do that? They're on the very brink of victory. They've got the whole thing sealed up, and the only thing that happened in front of them is this sacrifice, an act of desperation. What would make them decide to turn tail? Well, there have been a number of attempts to explain it, none of which seem to do much justice to it, except for one, in my opinion. And even if you disagree with my logic on this, for the sake of argument, accept it as I present it, because I think it applies to us in a very specific way. Moab, like all the nations in that world at that time, believed in multiple gods. But it was a little unusual to have one god as your focus, a national god, if you will. But theirs was Chemosh, and they worshiped Chemosh exclusively. But they acknowledged there were other gods, too, that were legitimate. I think the same thing could be said of the people in Israel, particularly those of the northern kingdom, but maybe even some or all of those that were with the forces of Judah and Edom. And so here they are. Their national god is Yahweh. But what if Chemosh actually comes to the aid of Moab? And again, some credibility goes to this, or some credence goes to this argument, if you remember that at least the forces of the northern kingdom were under Ahab for several decades, and Ahab had brought in Baal and Asherah and pushed Yahweh more or less to the fringes. So they already were trained to think in terms of other gods having power. Now there's this unbelievably destructive, horrific sacrifice done in full view of them. What are they to think? If you sacrifice the heir to your own throne, surely your God's going to do something. And so I think that with that in their minds, whatever else you can say, and maybe they were disgusted, that's what some people have said, but whatever else is going on, I think they thought there was just enough danger that Chemosh would come to their aid, that discretion was the better part of valor. And they left. We may not believe that there are other gods, but I think we do sometimes fall into this trap. That there are other powers, other principalities that may influence our lives, even though we only acknowledge one God. We call it practical monotheism. It means you only really believe in one God, but that's just practically speaking. You actually live in a way that might allow for the possibility of some other powers. So for instance, I won't ask you to admit if you are one of these, but if you gamble or play the lottery, do you know what you're doing? You are putting your future, your security, in the hands of the fates. The ancient Greeks said the fates were gods. Well, we may not acknowledge them as gods, but luck is something that you don't depend on if you depend on God. And yet many of us in the church do that very thing. Somebody asked me this morning after I preached at Grace how that applies to the stock market. It's a tough call, but the older I get, the more I'm inclined to think that playing the stock market is just the same. It's gambling. I don't hang my hat on that, and so I don't generally preach it, but it's something to consider. Politics is another arena in which this happens. If you're anything like me, and I'm being transparent here, every time an election comes around, a national election, you begin to fret and worry because what if the other side wins? What's that going to do to my life? Well, folks, there are people who live in far worse political conditions who are Christians and don't worry about those things because they trust 100% in God. They know that the only one who can care for them really, the only one who can assure them of a future is God. And so they don't let the current circumstances get them. But sometimes we Americans allow ourselves to think that just because there's a change in who's in authority, that somehow our lives are going to be ruined, like they have more power than God. My wife was telling me a story about when she was pregnant with her first child. They knew it was going to be a boy, and her grandfather said she was absolutely not to eat ice cream, because apparently ice cream might freeze off the masculine parts of the baby and she'd end up with a girl. Now, sexism aside, that is the epitome of what we're talking about. It's superstition, but it's saying that there is a force out there that might have control over your life in addition to beyond God. Can you think of any other superstitions? You ever have a bride who wants something borrowed, something new, or what is it? Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue? That's a superstition, folks. Bev told me also of a neighbor that she had when she was growing up. They were selling their house, and they announced to everybody that they had buried a statue of St. Joseph in the yard because apparently that would increase the odds that it would sell. Baloney! Pure and simple. Baloney. And these people were professing Christians. So what they were doing was they were putting stock in a power beyond God. We could go on and on with this. You need to ask yourself, what kinds of things in my life do I treat as having power similar to or more than God? Paul acknowledges the powers and principalities. He also says that Jesus won the victory over them on the cross. Remember that our God is utterly dependable. You can put your faith in God. This is the one who not only is powerful enough to handle your life, but also loves you so much that he was willing to sacrifice his own son for you. You don't have to depend on anything else. You don't need to carry around a lucky rabbit's foot or some other good luck charm or whatever. Your God is able. And he loves you so much, he's going to care for you. And the proof is Jesus. Just have faith. Just have faith.